Hello and welcome to the Punt, the show in which we look forward to the biggest sporting events of the month with the 42.e, brought to you in association with William Hill. Visit dinlouis.net on how to gamble responsibly. My own name is Gavin Casey, and this month in February, we're looking forward to the Super Bowl and a little bit of Six Nations later on as well. But starting with the American Oval Bowl, I'm delighted to be joined by our former colleague and reformed journalist, Stephen O'Rourke. Steve, how are things on your end?
Well, thanks. Reformed journalist is the nicest thing anyone said about me this week.
Let's continue in that vein. Delighted to be joined also by lead NFL analyst with Pro Football Focus, Sam Monson, another Irish NFL great. Sam, how are things on your end? Whereabouts in the world are you actually at the moment, Sam?
Cincinnati, Ohio. PFF HQ is Cincinnati, thanks to Chris Collinsworth being kind of based here since his NFL career.
Nice. Okay. Can I get some sort of a hype level off you, Sam, for this Super Bowl? You've seen enough of them over the years. How excited are you on a personal level for this one? Tampa Bay Bucks and Kansas City Chiefs.
Yeah, really excited. I mean, the storylines in this Super Bowl kind of speak for themselves. You've got the GOAT, Tom Brady, the greatest of all time, the best quarterback to ever do it, with a chance to, he's playing with house money. He's got a chance to push his legacy, not just to cement the greatest of all time status, but to push it into kind of mythical proportions of, Michael Jordan. And when people look back, it will always be stories of how Brady won anytime he wanted to, never lost a game, all that kind of stuff against the young pretender, a guy in Patrick Mahomes, who people think has a realistic shot to chase down Brady, to, set out his own dynasty and create this Tampa Bay Buccaneers or this Kansas City Chiefs team that can rival what we've just seen with the New England Patriots for the past 20 years. So I think it's a really fun Super Bowl.
Yeah, there does seem to be this kind of generational crossroads vibe to this one, Steve. We've seen memes flying around of adult GOAT and baby GOAT. And I guess this could be a changing of the guard, or it could be a continuation of this insane legacy that Brady has already left for himself, and Mahomes might have to wait before building that kind of dynasty. But if I was to have said to you at the start of the season, to focus on Brady to begin with, that Tom Brady would be back in a Super Bowl with this Tampa Bay Bucks team, based on what we've seen of them in previous years, and based on the fact that Brady is also 43 now, literally in his mid-40s. How surprised would you have been, or was this actually, in a relative sense, what you kind of expected Brady to do in Tampa Bay, to have the impact in which they're back in a Super Bowl for the first time in nearly 2 decades?
I'm not surprised they're back. I thought they were one of the top kind of 3 or 4 teams in the NFC. I think the NFC in general is slightly weaker than the AFC, so they had more of a chance of getting there. I honestly thought the Saints would be the team playing in the Super Bowl, but Drew Brees fell off the cliff. We kind of expect quarterbacks over the age of 40 to fall off, and Brady has just kept trucking on. You were talking about the memes about the age difference. To me, the most amazing stat of all this is that Byron Leftwich, Tom Brady's offensive coordinator, was a sophomore in college when Tom Brady started in the NFL. And now he's the offensive coordinator of the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, having graduated college, played professional football, retired and become a coach, and Brady is still going. So it kind of tells you, the longevity of this career. But I think they had a great defense anyway. So he was building on, well, not necessarily a great defense, but they had a good enough defense. And he was building on that by, the offense was okay last year. It just happened that Jameis Winston threw as many interceptions as he did touchdowns. If you scale back those interceptions, they become a much better offensive team as well. So no, I'm not surprised. I think it's the manner in which merging Brady's style of play, which has always been kind of dink and dunk, taking the short passes, with Bruce Arians' offensive philosophy, which has always been get the ball deep as quickly as possible. That's been the most interesting thing to see. And it did take a while, but they've got there.
Yeah, there was probably a little bit of a complication when we saw Brady go deep a few times towards the end of their last game against the Green Bay Sam. And it's an interesting one. Another Boston sporting great, Mickey Ward. I remember talking about his third fight with Arturo Gatti, and he felt himself getting old between rounds. And there were probably moments during this season in which it felt as though Tom Brady might have been at the precipice of that cliff that we've seen Drew Brees at over the course of this season. And yet in the next game or even the next quarter, he's reminded us of how great he truly is, and don't quite count him out yet. But were there concerns for you in the second half of that Packers game, or was it just a kind of a minor blip? Do you expect Brady to sort of write the record again off the back of that game?
Yeah, I don't think there was I don't think there are any concerns right now that Brady is ever going to look old. You know, I think that's the thing, is that there's no signs of that. He looks like he did when he was 25 years old, and has all season long. The only difference is he's playing in that offense that Steve talked about, that it is a high risk, aggressive, deep down the field passing attack. And sometimes, like, those are low percentage plays, and sometimes they don't go your way. It breaks against you. And when that happens, you're going to look bad. But when you look at Brady, there was a period during the season where his numbers on the deep ball were terrible. And people were saying, you know, is Brady done? Why can't he throw the deep pass anymore? Is this thing going to work? And then eventually he came out of that, and his numbers on the deep ball have been good. And, you know, the deep pass to Scotty Miller against the Packers just before halftime, like, those are the plays that they've been living on in the last couple of weeks. So, you know, I think really the amazing thing about Brady is when you look at him play now, there are no signs that he's reaching the end. There isn't, you know, Peyton Manning at the very end of his career for the last sort of year and a half looked like a guy who was physically done, but he was still smart enough that he was able to get by and play at a pretty high level. Drew Brees all this season has been getting by in the same way. His arm has been shot, but he's still one of the smartest quarterbacks to ever play and one of the most accurate, and he can still put the ball where it needs to go. It's just going to take a while to get there. Brady's arm looks fine. It looks the same as it did all the way through his career. He's having an ending that's more like Brett Favre, where, you know, Favre didn't physically decline in terms of arm strength or all those kinds of things. Brett Favre is like 50 something, could probably roll out there right now and have a top 10 NFL arm. What happened to him is he just started to break. You know, when he took a hit at the age of 41, 42, things started to break on the man that wouldn't when he was in his 30s. And Brett Favre played with a style that took a lot of hits. Brady doesn't, though. Brady doesn't take many hits at all. And therefore, if that's the thing that's sort of reaching the end for Brady, we might not know about it for a while. So even during this week, he's been talking about, you know, playing beyond 45. And when you watch him play, there's nothing to say that he can, which is just madness.
It is insanity, Stephen. We need to flip it as well here and talk about the potential generational talent, I would say undoubted generational talent that he faces in his opposite number, so to speak, this weekend. And I suppose for the Chiefs, it's not only about Patrick Mahomes. I think even a sort of a casual observer of the sport knows who Patrick Mahomes is at this point. He has that kind of cultural transcendence that maybe a Steph Curry had a couple of years ago with the Warriors and so on. But this Chiefs offense has been a joy to watch as a kind of a total package as well. They're talking about it as a three-headed offense with good reason. And really, apart from your Raiders, like, I can't think of other teams who've managed it at all well over the course of the season. So from the Bucs' point of view, we know their defense is strong. How do they stop this three-headed monster in the Chiefs in Mahomes, Kelsey, and Hill?
If I could answer that question with confidence, I would be earning a lot more money than I'm earning right now, I think. But like, I think you're right to mention the Raiders. I mean, the Raiders defense is, you know, it's a tire fire. It's horrific, and it was most of the season. But what they did really interestingly against the Chiefs was they showed a certain defensive look in the first half and showed the same in the second half, but actually ran different concepts. And Mahomes got confused. Travis Kelce got confused. There was one play in particular, it looked as if the Raiders had set up with two high safeties, and so Mahomes was expecting Kelce to go deep. Kelce saw the safety drop down into the box, so it was actually a different coverage, and sat in the middle of the field, and Mahomes overthrew him, and it nearly led to a pick. It was stuff like that. And that's really how the Bucs are going to have to stop them. It's like there's an element of showing one thing and doing another. And the most interesting part for me, I think, is that the Bucs are going to have to get away from what Todd Bowles does really well, which is blitzing, because Patrick Mahomes just eats the blitz. Like this season, I think the blitz average, or the Bucs average blitzes on 44% of possessions. They dropped that to 17 against the Chiefs, I think, in the first game, and Mahomes still chewed them up. So it has to drop even lower again. And that's going to be interesting, I think, because, like you said, if Tyreek Hill, who did all the damage against the Bucs in the first game, doesn't beat you, as we saw with Travis Kelce against the Bills, he's just an extra receiver. So he's going to beat you. So it's really difficult. I think there's an element of hope I think, when you go into a game against Patrick Mahomes. Obviously, there's a huge amount of prep and coaching, and it is easier to play a team a second time. But I do think if Patrick Mahomes can scramble, if Tyreek Hill can make broken plays, the Chiefs are going to win this relatively comfortably. I would think that's where everyone needs to, in their coverage, make sure you don't let Hill get that space on you. Make sure you don't let Kelsey drop into the zone. So, but there's just so many ways through the air the Chiefs can beat you. It's just going to be really, really tough.
Sam, there is a sense of inevitability about them when they get rolling, and they're rolling more often than they aren't. Like, I don't know why I keep bringing up memes, but there is that sort of Thanos feel to them. I am inevitable, and there's not really much you can do to stop them. Well, we've seen evidence of that throughout the season. But have you seen, aside from the Raiders, teams who have shown pictures or concepts that the Chiefs in particular have struggled with, or is it more a case of having to depend on them having an off day, and maybe Mahomes just throws a ball 6 inches too high, you get a pick in the first half that changes the trajectory of the game?
That, I think, is definitely, something that can always happen. Is we've seen, I think this happens in every game, but because, if it's Jacksonville versus the Jets in week 2, nobody cares. But in the playoffs, you suddenly notice that every weird fumble or bounce of a ball or muff punt, and you're like, wow, these things are all the preparation and all the talk we do heading into a game to predict what's going to happen. And then a guy dropping a punt is what this determines whether the game is going to go one way or the other. You have to hope that those things break in your direction if you're facing the Chiefs. But I think Mahomes and that Chiefs offense has reached this sort of transcendent point where I don't know what the game plan is supposed to be. With Tom Brady, you at least know what you're supposed to do against him. Whether or not you can achieve it, whether or not he's going to beat you anyway because he's one of the greatest to ever play, is another matter. But you at least know what the game plan should be. Mahomes, I don't think you do anymore. And I think that's also true with Aaron Rodgers when he's playing at his best, and a couple of players here and there. Mahomes just has the answers. And we've seen, in particular, the blitz is a great point, because if you come after him with that, a perfect NFL passer rating is 158.3. Against the blitz this season, Mahomes has a passer rating of 135.9. So he's almost got a perfect passer rating when you blitz him. And yet being aggressive and coming after him might still be your best bet, because maybe he does carve you up consistently, but that's what's going to create one turnover or one play that bounces in your direction. But the Ravens are a great example of a team that blitzes a lot. They're very creative on the back end, in terms of they disguise and they cover up the blitz very well and sort of put players where you typically want to go off the back of the blitz. And yet it was like Mahomes and the Chiefs just had the playbook. It was like they knew where the Ravens were going to put bodies and therefore knew where to target. Instead, it's incredibly difficult to figure out a way to stop this offense. And, certainly we saw the first time they played, like the Bucs had no idea in the first quarter. Tyreek Hill lit them up for over 200 yards. I'm sure they'll have learned from that. They made adjustments in that game, but this might be a game where you just sort of go out there from a defensive game plan and say, we're going to make like Mecole Hardman beat us, right? We're going to double team Travis Kelce and Tyreek Hill, make sure that there's bracket coverage on both those guys every single play. And if that means leaving like Clyde Edwards-Helaire literally unblocked or uncovered out of the backfield, it's a risk worth taking, and again, it's not like that's a sound strategy either. Like you're literally advocating leaving, players basically ignored out of the backfield because it's the lesser of two evils. And I'm pretty sure the Chiefs are one of those teams that are patient enough that if that's what you're going to give them, they're happy to throw the ball in that direction all day as well. But I think it's still a better option than just letting them win with plan A.
We know, Steve, that Andy Reid has more than one plan as well as the problem. And if plan A isn't going to script per se, he has it's not even plan A, B, C, and D. It's like plan A1, A2, A3, B1, B2, B3. And there are so many ways in which this team can beat you. We've seen Reid call plays, even in the playoffs alone, where it kind of boggles the mind, like probably the courage of the man in many ways. But it also speaks to the confidence he has in this team. Speaking about him in a kind of an overall context, if he was to win back-to-back Super Bowls, not to mention 2 Super Bowls, Where does he stand in the kind of greatest of all time rankings? I know it's an American obsession, obviously, to like talk about who is the best, but when you consider, I think Steelers won back-to-back twice in the 70s, Patriots and Brady were the last to do it in 2003, 2004. I think only 12 teams in NFL history have been in back-to-back Super Bowls alone. So for him to do it now, where does that put him in that kind of conversation with the Belichick and so on?
Well, when you look at the head coaches who've won just two Super Bowls, the back-to-backs, Vince Lombardi and Don Shula are they're the kind of names he's putting himself into the conversation with. I think when you're a coach as tenured as Andy Reid is, you can afford to be aggressive. You're not a new guy who is worried about their job 6 months down the line. Like Andy Reid has made his career, he has made his legacy almost. So, Sam talked earlier on about Tom Brady playing with house money. To a certain extent, Andy Reid is as well. And I think what I like about him is that, he plays, it feels like a cliche, but it's not. There's a lot of coaches who coach not to lose. But Andy Reid is not one of those. He coaches to win, and he puts his team in position where they're the aggressor. And if you're the aggressor, you cover boxing, to a much better extent than I do. Like if you're on the front foot, you've got an advantage through the fight. And it's the same it's the same if the other team is constantly reacting to you, then you're doing something well. But in terms of his overall legacy, in terms of offensive-minded coaches, it puts him right up there, I think, in the conversation. I mean, we think of Belichick, but we think of him as a defensive coach, even to an extent, the likes of Lombardi, and that we think is Bill Walsh is probably up there in terms of offense as well. So he really is in that conversation, but I don't think he even has to win to be in that conversation. I think his coaching tree speaks for how successful that has been, speaks to the type of coach he is. And we probably will look back at this era and say, because Belichick was winning all those titles, we probably didn't give Reid enough credit. And I'm glad to see him actually winning titles at the back end of it, to kind of that he does get that acknowledgement.
And in many ways, Sam, it might be a pointless conversation, and it might be kind of just an obsession to rank people and teams and so on in terms of legacy. But with somebody like Reid, and maybe Steve touches upon it there, it's more about just appreciating him for what he is. And like what I was going to ask you was, even in relation to somebody like Belichick, who we've seen become a serial winner to an unbelievable extent. He is one of the greatest coaches of all time in all sport. What is it that Reid does that sort of sets him apart even from his peers in how he coaches, in how he's perceived by players, media over there, and so on? Like, because it does feel as though there is a kind of a goodwill towards him, like maybe more of a gooey sort of feeling than it would be to someone like Belichick, who was that little bit more standoffish.
I think there's a degree of validation, right? Like I think everybody is happy that finally Andy Reid is getting the Super Bowl and potentially Super Bowls that sort of validates what everybody already knew, which is that he was this great coach. He was one of the best offensive minds that the game's ever had. But what we're seeing is how dependent great coaches are on getting a great quarterback. And if you don't have one, you can be amazing, but you're probably never going to get all the way over the line, particularly not if somebody else has one at the same time, and we're seeing that now with Bill Belichick. He had Tom Brady for 20 years, and therefore they won 6 Super Bowls. And a bunch of other people who should have won Super Bowls didn't, because Bill Belichick and the Patriots were standing in the way every single time. And that's what happened to Andy Reid. He got that Philadelphia team to 3 NFC championship games on the bounce. They were in the Super Bowl. They were a fantastic team, couldn't get over the line because Brady and Belichick were in the way. And we've seen Andy Reid elevate the play of a bunch of quarterbacks down the years. Andy Reid turned Alex Smith into a high-end quarterback who led the league in passer rating and had the Chiefs going to the playoffs. But then suddenly he stumbles into a Patrick Mahomes. And now you get to see what it's really capable of and all the things that they're doing. And he gets to like dig all the way down into the bag of tricks and just bring out anything he likes because Mahomes is good enough to get it done. And I think there is that sort of warm feeling because I think people are happy to see the guy succeed this way. Like he spent, 20 years toiling away with a bunch of quarterbacks that were never quite at this standard. And, Donovan McNabb would have been the best of the group. But even in McNabb's heyday, he had a bunch of detractors versus, the great quarterbacks of that time. So Reid finally gets Mahomes, and when he does, it's another three, back-to-back AFC Championship games and potentially repeat Super Bowl champions.
And Steve, let's talk about Belichick then, right? I know he's not involved this weekend, but it actually has potential implications for his legacy. I guess in a way, like Sam said with Reid, that legacy is kind of already set. Or sorry, you said it about Reid yourself. The legacy is kind of already established, but it would be an interesting, I don't know, branch from this story. If Brady goes to the Bucs, wins the Super Bowl in his first year there, during a season in which the Pats are pretty poor without him, to put it lightly, and particularly when you consider, Belichick didn't bring in Blaine Gabbert as quarterback. He had Cam Newton, who was MVP only a number of years ago. Okay, he might be sort of past his best, or at least he's been perpetually out of form for a while, but this was an established quarterback that he brought in, and they ultimately had a really poor season.
Yeah, I can distinctly remember the day that Cam Newton signed for the Patriots, and Twitter was basically, "Oh, we've let the Patriots win the AFC again," because everyone just assumed that Belichick was going to work his magic, and Josh McDaniels as OC there as well. Yeah, I think Sam's right though. It is a case of you need both. You need a great quarterback with a great coach. You can have a brilliant quarterback. If the coach isn't up to scratch, then you're wasting that talent. And we probably see that far more often than we see the inverse. But I think I think it's an interesting one, because I do think that there is very much the narrative that Brady and Belichick basically put up with each other. I didn't personally really get on with each other. Now, sometimes that could be a media construct or whatever. Anything, they had a functional winning relationship. We don't all get on with all our coworkers every time, but if we do our jobs right, we can achieve stuff. And that was kind of the Patriot way, so to speak, I suppose, was let's just win this. Let's go. That's why Brady took those pay cuts, so he could hire, get all those weapons around him and things like that. So for me, I don't think it tarnishes Belichick's legacy at all if Brady goes and wins the Super Bowl. But I do think it enhances the value people put on Brady's part of that, because people talk about Tom Brady being a system QB. That's one of the slights against him. Spoiler: all QBs are system QBs. I mean, if Patrick Mahomes doesn't have Tyreek Hill and Travis Kelce, if he has Jason Witten and any unnamed white receiver there instead as his primary weapons, he's a very different Patrick Mahomes. So it all kind of meshes together. But I think for Brady and for the TB12 program, I think to say that, look, we went to a new team, new conference, we still got there and we still won it, it's a nice kind of way to kind of put a bow on the end of that relationship with Belichick.
Yeah, and also, what's the system if you're Brady? I mean, they've ran half a dozen different systems in New England during his time there. Okay, they were all functionally, strictly speaking, the same sort of names, the same brand, but that thing evolved from being a deep passing attack to being a 2 tight end system to being a nothing but underneath passing. Brady, if he's a system quarterback, it's a system that has had multiple different iterations, all of which he's been able to execute well. So that was always, I think, an off-base criticism of him by people.
Yeah.
Steve mentions it would be a nice way to put a bow on the relationship, Sam. To me, it would be to absolutely take the piss out of this league and the sport for Brady to just switch teams and within one season at the age of 43 now, lead them to Super Bowl success, when you consider they haven't really been in that conversation at all for the last 2 decades since they last won it. That to me is mind-boggling stuff. I'm stating the obvious there, but in terms of his own legacy, forget about Belichick, I think it elevates it to the extent that maybe 2 more or 3 more of the Pats would have done.
Yeah, and it is ridiculous. And when you look at the way they've done it, I mean, their season was always a sort of 2-stage affair, right? Just get to the playoffs, however it needs to happen. You're probably not going to win the division. The New Orleans Saints are there. You have to figure out how you mesh this Brady 20 years of the same offense and same terminology with what Bruce Arians does for even longer in terms of deep passing, very opposite to what Brady's been doing in recent years. That was going to take some time. And with no preseason this year to do it or to practice it out because of COVID, it was always going to take some time. And then the second stage was, okay, now you've got to the playoffs. Now just make sure that you've learned the lessons that you accumulated through the regular season, so that when somebody throws something at you in the playoffs, it doesn't cause you problems to the point where you're done. You get bounced. You can't afford to lose games anymore. So show that you figured out the problems from when they occurred during the regular season. And they've done that. Both of them obviously successful. And then, you ride your luck a little bit against the Packers in the NFC Championship game, but to even make that game as close as it was and then get a win was an achievement. I thought Green Bay would fairly comfortably win that game, but it didn't happen. They were able to make those big key plays at the right time. And that really has been Brady's legacy throughout his career, is that he isn't always great, and he hasn't always been great. And, you think back to pretty much any Super Bowl he's won, you can point to a play where Brady could have, should have, maybe thrown it away, and it didn't happen. And then he came back and won it. The Atlanta Falcons, the 28-3 game, right? Brady threw the ball directly to a cornerback. I think the very play before the ridiculous Julian Edelman catch. There's basically one of those plays in every single Brady Super Bowl. So when people look and say, hey, he wasn't great in the second half, he made some mistakes, there was interceptions, he's always done that. But the thing about Brady is he finds a way to get past those plays and just hang around and be alive right at the death. And that's the play that he does make. And I know they relied on a sort of pass interference call, but Brady found that guy. Brady found the guy that was streaking across the middle of the field with Kevin King trailing in his wake. And usually when Kevin King's covering it, it's a pretty good place to go with the ball.
Steve, looking at how this game might play out, and there's so many variables here, it's really hard to put your finger on a potential pattern of the game. But if we were to use the old phrase, offense wins you games, defense wins you championships, is this a type of scenario where, despite the fact that one of the quarterbacks in this game is Tom Brady, it's his team and their defense are probably key to a potential Bucs victory versus that potentially unstoppable Chiefs offense being key to them? Is it sort of an offense versus defense type feel to this, or is that simplifying it too far?
No, I don't think it's simplifying it too far. I think in terms of DVOA, it's number 1 offense and number 16 defense versus number 3 offense and number 8 defense in the Bucs. Obviously, the latter, number 3 and number 8. I had a look at this because people do say like offense wins games, defense wins championship, and actually defense is still, even though it doesn't seem like it, defense is still winning championships. I think only 4 times since 2010 have the highest score, have the better offense actually won the game. So that's an interesting one. Now, usually it is between the top 2 or 3 offenses, so they are fairly evenly matched on that side of the ball. So ultimately, defense does come out on top. I think there's a lot that is riding, like you said, like Sam mentioned earlier on about, you don't like a muff punt could change complete everything we've talked about today. We could go and dive into detail, and that changed it. A center snapping the ball over the head of his quarterback for safety. All of these things can absolutely change it. I think the Bucs win this game if they do what Sam mentioned earlier on, which is bracket Hill and Kelsey, let Clyde Edwards-Helaire beat you. The Chiefs are not going to win this game on the ground. That is one thing we know for sure. They're certainly not going to win on the ground. They could still win it with short passes to their backs, absolutely, or to their lesser receivers like McCall Hardman or whatever. That's a possibility. But I do think there's lots of ways where the Bucs can stay in this game. One of the things the Bucs do really well, I think, on offense is that they leave their tight ends in run blocking, and running against the Chiefs is always a good strategy. The Raiders had 140, I think, it was 140 yards on the ground against them in that win. They chewed up 35 minutes on the clock. That's another way to keep to help yourself against the Chiefs. So if Leonard Fournette has a good game, and I think he's being used so much better in Tampa than he was in Jacksonville. In Jacksonville, people looked at Leonard Fournette and they thought, okay, we're going to run him up the middle. He doesn't really like doing that. He likes taking the ball and bouncing it outside. That's kind of the way he plays football, and the Bucs are letting him do that. So if he has a big game, the Bucs could very easily win this. But I was talking about, so that those tight ends coming in to help with run blocking is obviously beneficial to him because it helps set the edge or whatever, but it also helps free up one-to-one matchups then down the field for the receivers. For that deep game, we thought that the Bucs tend to throw in as well. So, like, while we do talk about this, transcendent Chiefs offense, there are a lot of ways that the Bucs can still win this game. But I do think like it happens too often for it to be just a quirk. This second quarter that the Chiefs and Mahomes tend to have, I think was it against the Texans last year where they were 24-0 down and at halftime were 28-4 up. They did similar to the Raiders last year in the second quarter as well, 4 touchdowns and stuff like that. It happens. They're really, really good in the second quarter. And Tom Brady traditionally has started game Super Bowls very, very slowly. Now, it's obviously a very different team, but that has to be in the back of his head as well about they're going to score in the second quarter. They're going to score a lot. We need to stay in this game. So I think if anyone's looking for a pattern, be very worried if you're a Tampa fan if you don't have 10 or more points on the board by the time the second quarter kicks off, I think.
The psychology of it is fascinating, Sam, because we've spoken here about probably the aura surrounding that Chiefs offense. And there's an element of inevitability, particularly in that second quarter, as Steve says. If you're a defense or if you're the opposition, that there must be subconsciously on some micro level a sort of sense that you can't hang with these guys. Whereas the probably like something similar is true of the Bucs now. The fact that they got over the Packers in the manner in which they did, and the fact that they have Brady at QB, and literally within his first season, they're at the gates of heaven, if you like. Like they will have this probably unshakable belief in their own ability. And so it's two teams that are probably going in more certain than other teams in previous years have been that they're actually going to win a game. And that makes for a kind of a fascinating dynamic. Like mistakes can still happen for sure, but it seems or it feels unlikely to me from this juncture that either team here could potentially bottle it, if you know what I mean.
Yeah, I think that's true. I don't think you're going to see a team led by Tom Brady ever, bottle it or choke in a spectacular fashion on the big stage. And I think Mahomes and the Chiefs are just too good for that to happen. So I think that's definitely true. What's interesting is that there's, the game flow and the way the game sort of develops can always change things as well. But what's weird is that the Chiefs are so good on offense that it almost breaks the kind of pattern for what should happen in that regard. Like if the Bucs get down big early, it's very difficult to see them climbing their way out of that hole. And I think they would know that as well. So if Kansas City jumps out to a big lead and, it gets 2 or 3 scores in the first or second quarter, I think heads would start to drop on the Bucs sideline because it's just impossible to see you not your offense, getting those points back, but it's impossible to see you stopping the Chiefs long enough for you to, overcome that kind of deficit. But on the other side, if Kansas City gets down big, they're almost happiest in that scenario. Like remember last year, they were down double-digit points in every single playoff game. Like putting the Chiefs in a hole is almost the worst thing you can do to them because then they kind of throw off all the conventional things that you're supposed to do on offense and, run the ball every now and again and be conservative. Like when they're down by 21, they just go, well, screw it. Let's start throwing the ball around. This is what we do well. And like, that's when they're at their most dangerous. So if the Bucs get down big, you can definitely see a way that they start to lose confidence that they can win this game. But if the Chiefs get down big, they almost become more dangerous.
So it does feel as though, as we're speaking, and as you guys are making sense of this game in my head, I'm leaning more towards the Chiefs because it feels as though there are just a couple more ways that they can actually win, or there's more going in their favor than the Bucs, marginally, albeit. Can I ask you, Sam, who you think is going to win, how you think they're going to win it? I think margin would probably be futile, but if you want to throw it in there, by all means, do.
I do think the Chiefs will win. And you're right. The more you talk it out, the more you come to the conclusion that the Chiefs are just better across the board. They have too many different ways that they can win. There's too much going in their favor for it to go the other way. But, PFF has a betting tool that we've got called PFF Green Line that kind of leverages all the PFF data to tell you where the line should be and who should win, all these kinds of things. And PFF actually thinks that the Bucs are closer than the Vegas spread. The line I think right now is 3 points. PFF Green Line has it at 2.5, and I think it is basically because Tampa Bay has a better defense. It's the number 1 offense or the number 2 offense, sorry, against the number 5 offense. It's the number 1 against the number 3 overall team. But the Bucs have the number 2 defense by PFF's ELO rankings, and the Chiefs are number 14. So Kansas City's defense is okay, but Tampa Bay's is legitimately good. And I know they got torched the last time they played, but it is still a thing that could be a differentiator in this game. And if the Bucs are going to win or keep it close and closer than the line, they're going to need that defense to do something.
Interesting. So I think Chiefs by a hair for Sam. Steve, you've looked at it from, I guess, a betting point of view on this side of the pond as well. You've kind of created a bet, I do believe. But before you get to it, give us your own thoughts, predictions. How's it going to go?
I'm actually going to lean the other way. I'm going to lean towards the Bucs because I think the one thing we haven't talked about, because it's not sexy to talk about offensive line play, is the fact that the Chiefs will be starting 2 backup tackles in a Super Bowl, which is suboptimal. And we saw what the Bucs did against the Packers when they had a backup tackle in the game. So I think that's going to be a factor that obviously it's not as fun to talk about as all the other parts of it, but it is something well worth watching. That's why I think maybe PFF's line is that little bit closer than the overall line as well, because I do think they can take real advantage of that. So I think in a relatively high scoring game, I don't think we see Brady going over 500 yards again, but I can see both quarterbacks getting there or thereabouts to 350, 400 yards. I think the Bucs by 4 points. I think not necessarily driving. I think the Chiefs will drive to win the game, but won't score. That will be how it will end. That's how confident I am in my prediction. But in terms of the actual bet, one of the things I really like, because I think it touches on everything we've spoken about before, which is that Leonard Fournette needs to run the ball, but Tyreek Hill is really hard to stop on the opposite side. So for me, it's Bucs to win. Leonard Fournette over 50 yards and Tyreek Hill over 85 receiving yards, and that's 13-2.
Nice one. Get on that. Gentlemen, thanks a million. Sam, thanks very much for your time. Enjoy the game. Speak to you soon.
Thanks for having me.
No problem. Steve, thank you as always. Great to see you.
You too,
and enjoy it. Let's hope it's a good one. Hopefully everybody at home enjoys the game. Predictions wise, I'm going to go with a draw, I think. Enjoy it. Mind yourselves. Now on to rugby. It's Six Nations time. We're going to spend the next 20 or so minutes chatting to our old friend Andy Dunne, who we haven't spoken to about rugby in a while. Andy, how are you keeping? First of all, are you all right?
I'm keeping very well, thanks, Gavan. Yeah, I've enjoyed somewhat of a rugby hiatus period over the last few months. So I think it was needed, and now feeling refreshed coming into hopefully an exciting Six Nations tournament.
May I ask you, if it's not too personal a question, what sparked the hiatus? Because, of course, famously after the World Cup, that was the last time I remember you taking some time out of the game. It had broken your heart and soul, so to speak, for a while.
Yeah, that's exactly what prompted the hiatus, the rugby hiatus, is boredom. I think a sport that is, I think there are cerebral minds who look at the game and will always find it engaging. I saw the Paul O'Connell interview yesterday and said even when the game appears stagnant and stale, he'll still find it intriguing to try and find the answers as to why. I'm a bit more of a consumer when it comes to it, and I've found it difficult to sit through some of the 80 minutes that are on offer on TV at present. So yeah, it's been a long old hangover since that World Cup, but I'm refreshed and I'm in positive mood and enthusiastic, hopeful for this Six Nations. Yeah.
Talk to me about Ireland then. We'll begin there and get some of the more depressing stuff out of the way, I guess, before we can speak about your beloved French and this English machine that seems likely to roll on in this year's tournament. But because you have taken a hiatus, I'm sure you've had the chance to collect your thoughts, compose yourself, and give a kind of a very balanced and fair analysis of what you've seen from Andy Farrell's men so far. Even going back as far as, say, the last Six Nations, which was obviously split between spring and autumn, and into the Autumn Nations Cup, where Ireland finished with a good performance and finished on a high results-wise at least. Do you see signs of hope, Andy?
Very much so. I think from the off, the positive signs really revolved around the selections. I think people will often get analysed at the top level where Farrell is. They'll get analysed in in different boxes. You know, are they a good on-field coach? Are they a good man manager? If we were to categorize him as a selector, I would say he's a very brave selector. He's made a lot of new choices, bold choices, risky choices. He's certainly demonstrated a willingness to pick people who are not the tried and trusted options. And I think that's to be embraced in Irish rugby. I think traditionally we've been very consistent selectors until a crisis happens, and then we throw everything out, the baby out with the bathwater at times. That's over the last 20, 30 years I'm really referring to. But certainly towards the latter end of Joe Schmidt's regime, he had quite a settled side. And when Farrell or any coach indeed comes into a new setup, I do think there's scope to be brave with selection. I think you get that grace period, and I'm delighted he took that opportunity to develop younger new players and throw in a few new caps. So that was a real cause for optimism and hope, and that mitigated for me a lot of the there was criticism around performance in those early games, particularly I think the Scottish game. Better performance against Wales, and obviously a very disrupted and broken up Six Nations. And obviously the Georgia game was heavily criticised, but I think we recovered well in the latter part of that Nations Cup, and played some good positive rugby where we the attack was not stunted. It wasn't constantly ruck to ruck. It wasn't breakdown orientated at all times. And I think there was significant cause for enthusiasm based at the tail end of last year, based on the latter performances in the Nations Cup. Yeah.
Just talking about selection, and I'm actually surprised to hear you speak so glowingly about, say, Farrell's willingness to experiment or blood new players. There are probably people out there who feel he's been nearly too conservative in that regard. Like when you consider, say, a matchday squad for Wales in the Six Nations opener. Okay, Caelan Doris has since been injured. He would have been only probably one of two new faces starting, like relatively new faces that Farrell has brought through, along with Hugo Keenan. And other than that, it kind of feels like the squad for these competitive games, properly competitive games in the Six Nations, would be like, fairly reminiscent of the squad that we saw even in the World Cup in 2019 that we know underperformed, underachieved. So, like, is it the case that you feel as though he's sort of bringing through a bit of a conveyor belt beneath that? Guys like Will Connors, for example, who might fill in this weekend, more so than the actual starting 15-23.
Yeah. I think it's probably an important distinction you've made. I still believe his starting 15, if we were to play a World Cup tomorrow, is not hugely different to what it was 2 years ago. But what he has done is brought in a significant number. He's capped a number of new players and given them exposure to international rugby. Again, a little bit of a false exposure in that a lot of those players who came in were playing in empty stadiums and didn't probably get that same exposure you'd get in front of 50,000 people, and the nervousness and the psychological challenges that come along with those early international games for players. But yes, he's developed, I think, an additional level of backup. He's developed, and he hasn't. It's a work in progress, but he's given those guys an initial impetus to join into the squad, to get comfortable in those surroundings. But then again, he's made a couple of other brave choices. A couple of games with Jamison Gibson Park in at 9, Will Connors selection at 7. A different selection of Peter O'Mahony at 7, who's obviously very much part of the furniture, but playing in a different position, and also seemed to look like a whole different type of player playing at 7 at the latter part of the Nations Cup. He looked far more like the old the Charles Olivon model of 7, or the former great Olivier Magne. I mean, O'Mahony's not typically compared to those players, but perhaps a new lease of life by a positional switch there as well. So again, in terms of selection, it's not absolute change, but it's sufficient enough change for me to feel optimistic. Yeah.
And just what you touched upon in relation to Ireland's attack specifically, people who listen to your punditry, with the 42 Rugby Weekly on other radio shows, podcasts, and so on will know you to have been critical in the past, and you were probably validated in your opinion post World Cup, as in your opinion prior to the World Cup was validated during that Ireland were probably a little bit too rock heavy. Maybe that the attack was it stagnated certainly under Schmidt towards the end, but also that it wasn't economical, and that even within the context of the modern game, had it been firing on all cylinders, it might not have been enough actually to progress that team. And we certainly saw no progress really between 2018 and 2019, or even into 2020. So when you mention the fact that they're not quite as adherent or married to that type of an attack, have you seen enough there over the course of Farrell's tenure so far, which is, you know, a year old now and more, to suggest that they are actually moving in the right direction? Or like, would you have expected with, say, Mike Catt's introduction that it might feel a little bit better oiled at this point? Like, because it only coming into the Wales game in the Nations Cup, there were probably serious concerns had across the country about this attack. So was it that Wales game that switched in your mind, or is it just more of a general progress?
I feel we need to give patience. I think we see signs that there's an encouragement for players to go off script. I think players are empowered to take a couple more risks. Again, I name checked Peter O'Mahony there, and you know, a memorable offload in that Welsh game in the Nations Cup. The type of thing he wouldn't ordinarily do. And he did not seek to do that at any stage, other than do what was his predestined and prescribed job. And certainly when we were in that period, in the latter stage of Joe Schmidt's tenure, we became very adherent to predictable type rugby and avoidance of mistakes. So the challenge when a new boss comes in like Farrell, and he's got to put his own imprint on the style we play, is that in order to bring in change, does he fundamentally change everything? And have we seen enough change, or does he do it bit by bit? And I think he's chosen the safer option there. He'll try and implement it bit by bit. But let's be frank, there were good parts to the Irish squad under a 5-year, 6-year Joe Schmidt regime. We had a Grand Slam, 2 championships, and a lot of experienced, talented players. So I think if Farrell is going to try and introduce change, he's trying to do it in a incremental way. You know, if we're to compare how teams might change in the past, I know Argentina after the 2011 World Cup fundamentally changed how they were going to play, and to their own detriment. I mean, they went out and lost 78-12 against South Africa down in Durban, but they were fully committed to playing a offload game wherever possible on the field. And that's what happens in international rugby when you make root and branch changes, is you know, somewhere early on you get a hiding or two, and you either stick with it and persist, which Argentina did, and you reap the rewards. 3-4 years later, the results got better gradually. They earned patience from a public forum. People started to become more forgiving, and lo and behold, the 2015 World Cup, they tore us apart through offloads. We tend not to manage change like that. We don't seem to look 4 years ahead. We don't look at, despite all our protestations about not performing at World Cups, I think if you want to perform at a World Cup, you've got to plan 3 to 4 years in advance, and you've got to take some pain in around your performances. And if I see some green shoots around the offload game, a bit less structure in our attack, I'm on board with that. I think it's a good start.
So you reckon the change under Farrell will be kind of more incremental, but when we're talking about a potential 4-year plan for a World Cup, for example, do South Africa, the current world champions, not sort of tear that script up? But maybe the idea of planning for 4 years is nearly what dug us into that hole last time around, in that we were too married to a plan, whereas Rassie Erasmus took charge of the Springboks in the middle of a World Cup cycle and led them to World Cup glory? Or is it the case that maybe when Rassie came in, he took a punt and it wasn't so much incremental change he was looking for? He absolutely tore up the plans of his predecessor and just did his own thing, took a punt. Might have gone horribly wrong, it just worked out.
Yeah, well, like I suppose you've given different examples. There are many variables. I think the consistency I see in Irish approaches to World Cups is that we don't develop style in our play. We don't change style in our play. Is we work on, and this comes from IRFU level, board level, I think, management, where they insist that the Six Nations is the biggest revenue generator, and therefore we need to win in order to maintain momentum, in order to keep Irish rugby at forefront of people's mindsets. And so there's a huge amount of pressure put on the Irish coaches to win the next game. And I think people look at the Six Nations in the Northern Hemisphere as the be all and end all. From year in, year out, we tear each other to shreds. And then you just arrive at the World Cup and you haven't developed any ability to change your style, any ability to be versatile, to have, we can play multiple ways in the same match. We look at a lot of the Premier League football teams now, and there's a fluency to how they play or adapt. You see significant changes in formation at half time based on what the opposition are doing. And I think that rigidity in rugby hasn't helped the Irish approach. And then when we come to a World Cup, we become, as dare I say, predictable again. What I'm seeing in those initial games under Farrell is not polished, far from the finished article, but slightly less predictable in attack. And I'm something I absolutely am enthusiastic about.
We'll wrap back around to see what you make of Ireland's chances in the tournament, but let's talk about France and England to begin with. And might start with England, given they are reigning champions, given they do seem to be the preeminent force in the Northern Hemisphere, despite the fact that the French do appear to be coming. I don't know, with England, it's an interesting one, Andy. Like, if you look back on even their last two defeats that I can think of off the top of my head, France in last year's Six Nations would indicate that they are in some ways beatable. I think the World Cup final against South Africa has an enormous caveat in the fact that they had a disaster with injury at front row, and South Africa basically picked them apart at the scrum and built from there. So I think you can throw an asterisk next to that one. The French one was more kind of a nip and tuck, mano a mano sort of battle that the French came out on top of. But given what we've seen of England and the way Eddie Jones has implemented a attacking variety, kicking variety specifically as well, and that's probably transformed England's ability to attack. And also the fact that they now are almost married to a kicking game, if you like. Jones seems absolutely insistent, even against Georgia when they probably could have racked up 80 or 90 points that they played off the cuff. They stuck to what Jones believes will be a game plan that would beat better teams. We saw similar as well in that Italy game in Rome in the Six Nations. But it's working for them, and it seems difficult to stop. It does feel as though they're a more complete team and even a more rounded team, even if they don't show it now, than they were, say, in the World Cup or even actually at the start of last year's Six Nations. And with that in mind, can they even be stopped? Because they do feel kind of inconquerable at the moment.
Yeah, I think Eddie Jones he likes to play chess with the media, with his own players, with oppositions. He likes to throw a grenade in on match week, and he generally likes to stir it up. But I think a lot of that is effectively a facade to distract away from what he's very, very good at. I think he is very flexible in terms of his approach. I think he can absolutely build a side, which he's done, that seems like it has this juggernaut type forward pack. But similarly, he's been in very, very much embraced width and pace in the back line if and when they choose to utilize it. And what we've seen is they've slavishly kept on to the box kicking game and the forward pack game, and have been criticised for it. I doubt Eddie Jones gives a hoot about that criticism, but I suspect there's an underlying willingness or ability to change that entire game plan and do it quickly. I think he's building different ways to play. I think he's using games as practice games. Probably none more so obvious to us than the recent couple of games against Ireland, which really did look like training runouts for the English side in terms of let's just work on our defence. And I would not be surprised in any way if Eddie Jones was looking to achieve that type of outcome from certain games. I think he's more versatile in terms of how England are going to play than we might believe right now, based on the last couple of months. Not entirely reliant on the forward juggernaut pack. Nonetheless, it's a hugely fearful presentation for most opposition sides. That English pack, for my mind, probably the strongest in the world at the moment. And then a back line that has a very complete look to it in terms of personnel, in terms of what they can get at halfback, in midfield, and then that pace out wide. And similarly, then he's thrown in some young uncapped players into the mix for this Six Nations too. Paolo Dugway, I think I pronounced the name wrong, come in from Wasps, is the top Premiership scorer this year. So he's prepared to throw young guys in as well. So yeah, they're to me they're a compelling viewing. He's based on the mind games he plays, based on the approach he's taken in the last couple of World Cups with Japan, and then with years back, and now with England, and seeing how he likes to build and put pressure on his players and set targets and be vocal and very transparent about those targets. He's an interesting character, and I think they're building something special there.
When you talk about that, those last two Ireland games, and probably more so the most recent one between England and Ireland at Twickenham being almost like a training run out for England, and when you consider the contentment with which they just absorbed Ireland, particularly in that second half, and it felt like almost toying with Ireland despite not having the ball. There was a really strange vibe to it, and it did feel very what's the word, like it felt very sectional, like this was the plan, was to like get something out of a game, learnings out of a game, and like the result will look after itself. It's a little bit debilitating, I think, from an Irish point of view, to see your team used like that, violated in a way. And like, I don't know, there were arguments then, like Keith Earls as a break down the right wing might have done better, actually, might have taken a chance, and it switches the kind of pattern of the game, or changes the momentum of the game in that Ireland score. And yet it does feel as though England have gears to move up here, like that. We haven't seen the best of them in recent encounters between the two countries. So like, looking at Ireland, looking at England, is there even a point in us, Ireland, looking towards winning a competition here, beating England, like, or are we absolutely deluded in even hoping that's possible this time around?
Well, I think there's always hope in looking at winning the tournament, but I don't think it should be our desired outcome. It would be great if it happened, but I would rather see, I mean, if we lost to England but played an entirely different way, I would accept that as progress. I think what I feel like I would find it very difficult to accept that we go in, I think that would be the fifth occasion in a row, and play England with the same tactics. We've tried blunt force trauma 4 times in a row and came up a distant second 4 times in a row. We've been physically dominated for 80 minutes 4 times in a row, and we keep coming back for more, as if we're going to magically get stronger than them physically. I just don't see it happening. It's really a case of it plays into their hands so well. I think if we play a far more dynamic game, we try and reduce the ruck count for example, by taking risks and more offloads, yes, we may surrender possession, but it's far better than holding possession for the length of time we've held it and just running into that wall again and again until we're so tired we can barely stand. And that's what we've done in a that I don't think I don't accept that's a simplification even, or people say that's a gross oversimplification. I don't accept it. We've simply picked up the ball and run directly into England's biggest players on repeat 4 games in a row in a bid that will eventually grind them down, and it's just borderline suicide at this stage. If we see that again, I'd be pretty crestfallen. I think we've got to, we saw a nice chip kick by Billy Burns, and Stockdale running in late on. It was too late at that stage. However, it showed some ingenuity, and it puts some sense of doubt into that English defence. And we have to create doubt against a defence like that. We simply won't barge them over through persistence, perseverance. I just can't see it happening. So that'd be far more important sign to me that we're on the road to improvement. If we show that bravery to mix it up from a tactical point of view, to take those risks, to surrender possession if needs be. We do not need to hold possession for the game against England. I would prefer to see us have less possession than more, in fact. And at least when we have possession, try and be a little more cutting and take a few risks. An interesting way of pattern I've noted is we've seemed to got very comfortable hitting our 12 up off scrums, no matter where it happens. Just send the 12 in to the opposition. And when the space is at such a premium in the modern game, it's the one opportunity you get where the field has opened up and there's countless areas of space. If we see our 12 just running into the opposition 10 or 12 in order to set up more rucks off a scrum, I think we're going back into suicide mode. So hopefully that's abandoned, that tactic. You mentioned Cat. Mike Cat was a renowned player for innovation. He has coached in teams successfully and in an innovative way, but he's probably coached in teams that also have juggernaut packs. Now he's in an Irish pack that are probably not going to steamroll opposition, so he's got to be extra innovative, and I hope we can see that.
Yeah, any more crash balls from 12, you'll be taking other hiatus, I gather. We need to chat about...
Yeah, I may retire from punditry, yeah.
Let's chat about France then and cheer you up. I'll finish on a high note because it does feel as though this renaissance under Fabien Galtier is legitimate now at this point. You mentioned that Ireland need to sort of sow doubt in English minds when they meet again this time around. The only team against which England will have any doubt is France. They do feel as though they're a coming force. There seems to be actual substance beneath this rebirth. And yet, when we think of the great French teams over the past, we're going back 2 decades, or a decade and more since they were last legitimately good. But even throughout their history, and the jouet and the joie de vivre with which they play, that's actually not so much the case with this French team. They do feel more practical, more pragmatic. They can still be absolutely enjoyable to watch, don't get me wrong. They kick more ball than anybody else in the Six Nations, so they seem equally content to play without the ball this time around. It's not only about playing with flair. It seems to be a little bit more mechanical and more methodical with them this time around.
Yes, I think there's a pragmatism to Galtier that is, I think, is a good antidote for that French approach that has let them down in the past. That French approach that we all love so much, but you don't know it depends what side of bed they get out of. Are they going to play? And I think he's a cerebral mind. He's well known when he played as a brilliant tactician, and I think he's brought that into the French approach, where it's simply not good enough to just give it a shot, from be as unpredictable as you like. And if you have a good day, you beat the All Blacks, as they often have, but on a bad day, they can lose to a poor Scottish side, or struggle against an Italian side. I think they're building a squad now. As if we compare other sides, you mentioned obviously England, and we talked at length about England. We're looking at the next couple of years getting back to that rivalry that maybe we saw from about 87 to about 94, 1987 about 94, where England and France were by a distance the two best sides in the Six Nations, and just served up year on year these awesome encounters. Now they were punctuated by violence at that stage, and back, and that made it all the more entertaining. That's not going to happen anymore, but I think we're seeing two sides that are probably going to be at the top of the Six Nations for the next couple of seasons, and two sides that will challenge each other. We saw French, almost a second string French side, robbed at the death against England in their last game, and it showed again that was a warning sign that how much depth they have in that French squad. But I think overall that pragmatism that we mentioned that Galtier has around playing similar styles to others, and learning how to do that well, that's okay in the French circumstance, because they've always got the escape clause that run out the back door and do what nobody expects. They do that better than everyone. But I think he's bringing that pragmatism in, and he's also got in Antoine Dupont, arguably the best scrum half in the world, and he's alongside his captain in Olivon. They've got some brilliant on-field marshals, and again, it's probably not something that's always been synonymous with French rugby, is who's directing things on the field. At times it looks like nobody is, and that's their threat. But they seem to have that hierarchy of power developed on the field now, where they've got clear direction and leadership from players in live situations. And I think that's coming down from the top, through Galtier, through Dupont, through Olivon, and making them a fearsome prospect.
That actually is the frightening part of this, is the fact that if they can play like everybody else, they have the depth, they have the level of talent that would dictate that they're better than most, if not everybody else. As you mentioned, that England game, excuse me, in the Nations Cup, France go in with a second string 23 effectively, and nearly roll England over. Probably should have. You mentioned the likes of Dupont. We know he's kind of incomparable really in the world game at the moment, but if you have a team who can play fundamentally sound rugby with the individuals that they have, and you also have that added string to your bow of the French sort of DNA and an ability to switch it on in key moments, it makes it a frightening prospect, not just for the next couple of seasons, but when you look at the age profile of that squad, potentially for a decade, dare I say it. And it does feel as though maybe England and France are beginning to pull away, almost a mirror image of what's happening actually in the Women's Six Nations, where at the risk of sounding over dramatic, you could be potentially looking at a kind of a two-tier competition. England and France vying for the championships, as you say, and the rest of us just scrapping for maybe an off year for both of them.
Yeah, well, I mean, I hope that's not the case, but and I don't think the gap will widen to that extent. I don't think it's going to be so divergent. I do think there's a gap, and I think it's up to Wales, Scotland, Ireland to get closer, and they'll have to be a little more imaginative in how they do that. I think what we see is that in terms of the best overall squads, the greatest strength and depth, really the greatest ability is clearly lies within the French and English squads. What is daunting about the French is that they've the age profile of that squad, and the fact that their next World Cup is at home, and they I think very, very clearly have looked at this as a 4-year cycle. I think more so than most. They're unapologetic, and they're saying we are building towards a home World Cup that we want to win at home, and that is a daunting prospect, because They have a young age profile, but it hasn't overly affected results, and it hasn't overly affected performance. So a lot of momentum there, I think, possible for them to build in the next few years. And I would be very hopeful, while there is that existing gap, I think, between the English, French, and then the other, well, Wales, Ireland, Scotland, and then Italy are way off behind. But I think I'd like to see changes and imagination in attack from Wales, Scotland, and Ireland in order to close that gap. I think there's a small gap there, but I don't see it continuously getting bigger and bigger, provided the Celtic nations are prepared to take a few risks.
So, Andy, bearing all of that in mind, and bearing our concerns in mind regarding potential French / English dominance, what are reasonable expectations for Ireland going into this competition this time around? Like, are we looking for the change to which you allude and a sort of a third place finish that keeps things ticking over a little bit in the middle of a World Cup cycle? Or do you need to see Ireland get a result against either England or France, both of whom were playing at home, albeit without the sort of natural advantages of having a crowd there?
My personal preference and my view is that, I would accept third with a significantly improved performance around our style of play. I think if we finish third by default, because we couldn't get near England and France and played the same style of rugby that hasn't worked in recent years against them, that would be a big disappointment. However, if we took it to France and England in a very different way, particularly the English game, if we break it up a bit more and play a more unstructured, risky type of game that isn't possession based, and still finish third, that would be big progress to me. So the end position of third, it depends on the style of which we play. I mean, the way the fixtures fall in the Six Nations is always important, and obviously this year we've England and France at home, but we won't have the home field advantage from the Irish crowd. So that may take away obviously from the challenge for France and England. They're not traveling clearly to boisterous Aviva. So this year, probably more than ever, the way the fixtures have fallen is not lying in our favour as much as it could. So the home advantage against England, France is usually significant, and does often lead us to dream at the start of the Six Nations. If England and France at home, and a slightly substandard Wales and Scotland away, and we'll pick off Italy. Who knows? Maybe we can dare to dream. So ultimately, I think improved performances and improved attacking style against England and France at home, and I think we're good enough right now to go and pick up away wins in Wales, Scotland, and Italy. So if we can, who knows? We may sneak into the top two if we pick off an English or French side. That'd be great. But I think third is probably my bet. Yeah.
Yeah, if we snake one against France, then it's all to play for potentially going into that last day against England. Overall competition winner. Sorry, did you just give me that prediction actually?
No, I think we'll probably finish third. Overall competition winners, I'm going to go with England.
England, okay, 6-5 with William Hill for England. France, I think, are 5-2, something along those lines. Ireland are a little bit further out. I'm checking here, 7-2. So, only a little bit further out. Who knows? Maybe they know something we don't. Andy, thanks a million. Great to speak to you again.
Take care, Gav.
Enjoy it. And thanks a million to everybody at home as well for tuning in. Dunleary.net on how to gamble responsibly. We will be back next month with the Punt. In the meantime, we'll have the 42 Rugby Weekly with Murray Kinsella and all of the other offerings from 42 membership, members.the42.ie, if you want to sign up there and get all of the extra podcasts and content. Until next time, mind yourselves. Take it easy.